Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About It, the podcast where we talk about books and the ideas in those books. I'm your host, Chris Brown.
And I'm Guggen Douglas.
And today we're discussing the wonderful and brilliant C.S. Lewis book, The Problem of Pain.
Is it a problem?
Well, I'd say so. I mean, Lewis wrote an entire book on it, so there has to be something there.
Right. It's interesting we're doing this now because pain has been coming up a lot. Recently, the southern half of our country is underwater, the northwestern part is on fire, and even in our community, we just had a school shooting.
Which is why I think it's so important to be discussing this book now. Lewis dives into exactly what pain is and how we as Christians should respond to it.
For example, Lewis says that there's two types of pains. Pain A is more physical, whereas pain B is synonymous with suffering, anguish, tribulation, and adversity or trouble.
I think pain B is the most prevalent in today's society. Yes, we have physical pains, but they can go away with medication. But pain B deals with the harder, more long-lasting pain.
Exactly, which is why Lewis brings God into the equation.
Lewis wasn't always a believer, though.
No, he was not.
He was rather a dark and twisty atheist.
Dark and twisty?
Yes, he's like a dark tornado of sadness and pain mixed with cool, unfeeling logic that was all jumbled up inside. Dark and twisty.
If you say so.
I do. And he says that before he was a believer, he would have used this logic. Look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. The bodies which move in this space are so few and so small in comparison with the space itself that every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures. It would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than a byproduct to the power that made the universe.
Wow, that was rather dark and twisty.
My point exactly. Luckily for us, he got rid of the dark and twisty parts and became a believer instead. He still uses his logic to make his appeals, though.
Like when he decided to get down to the reason why Christians struggle with pain, even though we have a loving and a merciful God.
Correct. Lewis appeals to rational thought by saying, if the universe is so bad, or even half so bad, how on earth did human beings ever come to attribute it to the activity of a wise and good creator? Men are fools, perhaps, but hardly so foolish as that. Most atheists, or anti-theists as Lewis calls them, would agree to this point. To them, God was created out of a primitive need to have something to attribute the unseen forces of this world to. But now, we have a more sophisticated thought process and have no need for such juvenile notions.
I think you put it right, Chris. Dark and twisty.
Yes, it is. But Lewis says that the anti-theists are just misguided by a wrong view of God.
Yeah, as he says, we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, a senile benevolence who, as they say, like to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all.
Which isn't how God works at all.
No, it's not. But isn't that how most Christians view God? Then when we have to deal with something that causes us a great pain, we wonder why Grandpa isn't going to swoop down and fix things, or even why he allowed it in the first place.
I like when Lewis says, in the same way, it is natural for us to wish that God had designed for us a less glorious and less arduous destiny. But then we are wishing not for more love, but for less. To Lewis, the problem begins with settling for a lesser version of God.
Interesting. So Lewis thinks that by wanting a grandpa to fix everything, we are actually asking for something that is not only not God, but also less love.
Which is strange if you think about it. We're so selfish in our own human views that we think a loving God would just take away all of our problems, when that just isn't the case. A loving God helps us through our pain. He's there for us when we need him most.
So what Lewis is getting at here is that we are fallen people. He says that from the moment a creature becomes aware of God, of itself as self, the terrible alternative of choosing God or self for the center is open to it.
So, because of our sin nature, we are going to have to experience pain. Because we don't have Grandpa, but yet we have God, we must experience the natural causes of our sin.
Lewis brings up an interesting point about pain. He says, and I quote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
So, in a sense, God uses our pain to get us to listen to him?
I think, Chris, that's what Lewis is getting at here. He says that we only offer up to him what we have when it is no longer our best. According to Lewis, he will have us even though we have shown that we prefer everything else to him, and come to him because there isn't anything better now to be had. It is hardly complimentary to God that we should choose him as an alternative to hell, yet even this he accepts. So basically, even though God takes us as we are, he's not content for us to remain that way. He loves us, but makes us lovable as well. Lewis says love, by definition, seeks to enjoy its object.
I think this is what Lewis defines as divine humility, that God stoops down to our level to show us the error of our ways, but accepts us just the same. If we didn't offend him or break his heart, as if we didn't offend him or break his heart in any way, while what we call our own life remains agreeable, we will not surrender it to him. What then can God do in our interest but make our own life less agreeable to us and take away the plausible source of happiness? It's just there where God's providence seems at first to be most cruel, that the divine humility, the stooping down of the highest, most deserves praise.
Hmm. I'm starting to see the dark and twisty part of God's love.
But there's hope. Lewis points out that despite the way we treat God, he treats us better.
Hmm. Doesn't he say why else were individuals created but that God, loving all infinitely, should love each other differently? Or rather, love each differently. So God, because of his infinite love for us, seeks to enjoy us, but then we go and try to put limitations on that love and turn away from that love, which causes us pain.
I think that's what is being said here.
But if we take that logic out to its furthest conclusion, we then are left with the question, well, why do bad things happen to good people?
But that's just the thing. We aren't good people. Not apart from God. We have to live with the natural consequences of our sin. Even the best people, by earthly standards, are still sinners. Even they, just like us, deserve hell. Lewis even says, in all discussions of hell, we should keep steadily before our eyes the possible damnation of ourselves.
So, in order to be saved, we experience pain to draw closer to God, but we are redeemed nonetheless.
Possibly an oversimplification, but yeah, I think that's what's being said.
I don't think I'll ever be able to wrap my head around that.
I don't think we're supposed to. What is it you always say? If we control religion, then we get to control who God is. This is what Lewis is saying too. We have a wrong view of God.
It's like when Lewis says, we must remember that the soul is but a hollow which God fills. Its union with God is, almost by definition, a continual self abandonment, an opening, an unveiling, a surrender of itself. So we have to leave all those things that we think are good and bad to follow Him.
So we've learned quite a few things today.
Yes, we definitely have. We have learned that humans have a wrong view of God, that we don't treat him the way he deserves to be treated, but that God loves us so much he accepts it, loves us anyways.
And that dark and twisty is a completely acceptable descriptor.
So to answer the question of what is the problem with pain, it's not that we experience it, but it's more how we handle it.
I think that's an accurate assumption. We aren't turning to God in his obvious attempts to get us to speak to him.
I think it's almost important to point out that simply talking to God every day isn't going to make your problems go away.
Not at all. Problems and pain are a part of life. I don't believe that that's what Lewis is saying. I don't think he's saying that our problems will just go away if we trust God more. I believe that he's saying while we experience these problems, we need to trust God more. The two need to happen together. One doesn't cause the other.
Well, that was well said, Chris, and a good quote to wrap up this podcast of Dark and Twisty. Is a bit dark and twisty, but a still good one. So Lewis says, if tribulation is a necessary element in redemption, we must anticipate that it will never cease till God sees the world to be either redeemed or no further redeemable.
Well, I like it. This has been Let's Talk About It. I'm Chris.
And I'm Dragon.
And we'll talk to you all next week.